Hello guys and welcome back. Today I want to go through this year's upcoming NHL offseason to see which players are most likely to get dealt this summer. Now, even though we still have the NHL playoffs to come, we got a pretty good indication of which teams might be going in a different direction and which trades we might see because of it. So make sure you watch till the end as we go through the players that I believe are the most likely to get dealt this summer, including potential players on your favorite team. And of course, hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content leading up to the draft, to the NHL playoffs, and of course, to this year's NHL free agency. And let's get straight into the picks today, presented by BetUS. Now, as we go through the 15 names I'll mention here today, we're going to start with the more obvious ones and then go into the surprises later on. For my first player I want to mention, let's go on to Vladimir Tarasenko, who I think is basically as big of a slam dunk as you can get. In terms of his contract, he makes $4.75 million for this year and next, and in Tarasenko's case, I think he's just somebody that hasn't been a fit. I mean, he was somebody that I speculated could have been a potential trade deadline deal, but of course, that didn't end up happening. Detroit stayed pretty quiet, but I think this offseason, we'll see them make a bunch of big moves to try to bolster that lineup, especially if they were to miss the playoffs again. You see in terms of the production, though, just 10 goals, 21 assists, 31 points in 74 games, especially the goal scoring has had a sharp decline in his time with Detroit, and especially since he's been playing mostly on the third line this year, I don't see that really getting all that much better. But the thing is, I don't really blame the Red Wings for not playing him as much as he maybe could on other teams, because you already got right wings in Lucas Raymond and Patrick Kane, and those spots are pretty solidified in the top six. I think for Tarasenko, he can still be especially a second line power play type of wing, but just hasn't really gotten that opportunity in Detroit. And especially for Tarasenko, even though he got that Stanley Cup win, if he's still looking for Stanley Cups, I don't know if this Detroit team, unless they make massive changes, is the team to get him there again. Now, the thing to note is also the trade protection on Tarasenko's contract. In his first year here with Detroit, he had a full no-trade clause. But with next season and with the offseason rolling over, he'll now have a modified no-trade clause. So it becomes a lot easier to deal him, and I think that's a big reason why we will see an offseason trade rather than a deadline deal. Now, I'm not stopping with the Detroit Red Wings because next up, I have Justin Holl, who is in a pretty similar position, I would say, to Tarasenko, making too much money, especially for the role that he's playing. In general, I'm not really sure what Detroit is doing with their defense. I like a lot of the younger options, but it seems like they've surrounded them with just these weak depth additions that just are playing way too high in the lineup, and you, of course, have Ben Sherratt in that similar position. Justin Holl is in a similar position as well, somebody that was signed to a multi-year contract that really shouldn't have been. Another player for Detroit, they just gave out trade protection as well, having a 10-team no-trade list. You combine that with the fact that he's still making $3.4 million for this year and next, and it will be a tough sell, especially with how really irrelevant he's been with Detroit so far. I thought that Justin Holl was okay in his first year for Detroit, but it was a pretty limited sample size, only playing 38 games. But this year, playing 68 games, has just 5 points, and is only playing around $14.50 a night, which for a defenseman that they're paying $3.4 million just kind of seems strange to me. I think the number one thing that Detroit needs to focus on in this offseason is revamping that defense. Of course, you will have Axel Sandin-Pellikka coming into the fold, which will help quite a bit, but give them options to work with that aren't the Ben Sherratts, the Jeff Petries, the Justin Holls of the world. You can find better options than that, I'm sure. If Steve Yzerman can get creative, then I think this defense could become a strength for Detroit as soon as next year with the youth coming up, but players like Justin Holl, I just don't think are going to be there to make it happen. Next up, let's move on to the younger side of things here, and let's go on to the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, I was contemplating between Philip Kurashev and Lukas Reichel, but to me, I think Lukas Reichel is one of the most interesting and I think likely younger players in the league to get traded this offseason. He just has not felt like a fit whatsoever in this Blackhawks system, in this Blackhawks franchise. No matter the coach, no matter the situation, whenever he's been in the NHL, it just hasn't seemed to work. Point production wise, he's been pretty okay this year in 67 games, 7 goals, 14 assists, 21 points, playing on the fourth line most of the year. Honestly, not bad for a 22-year-old. But that's just the thing. It seems like Reichel never really gets this sustained length of opportunity. He'll get a game here and there where he's maybe in the top 6, but then they automatically just dump him down at the first sign of inconsistency. And I think for a player like that, who is by himself a little bit inconsistent and has his ups and downs, that's not what you want to give. His confidence has been at an all-time low with Chicago, and I think for his sake, honestly, and really for Chicago's sake as well, I hope we see a trade. And especially with Chicago, I think, wanting to improve a lot next year and bringing in some even more youthful additions in that bottom 6, I think Reichel's spot especially is going to dry up quick. Now let's keep on with the Western Conference, and let's go on to the first goaltender of today's list that I think will get traded in this year's offseason. Let's go on to John Gibson of the Anaheim Ducks, who I think is also a pretty big slam dunk for a multitude of reasons. I think in Gibson's case, this is the perfect time to trade him because this year, he's actually been pretty good. You can see in 29 games, a .912 save percentage, getting not thrown to the Wolves every single night, and having Dostal really take that load has honestly been great for Gibson's career. But I do think the big thing that will lead to a trade is just that cap hit. With Dostal coming in, becoming the starter, paying $6.4 million to a guy that's been a solid backup, but a backup for the Ducks, I think is just something they won't be able to stomach, especially with the Ducks maybe being aggressive this offseason. I mean, we saw how aggressive they were last offseason, almost getting players like Steven Stamkos. I think they're in a position to also spend big this summer, and having that type of cap hit, I think limits them quite a bit. Even though they still have a lot of cap to give, trading Gibson, I mean, could really open it up. He's another player like Reichel, though, that I just honestly want to see get dealt because I don't think he's going to be able to surpass Dostal at this rate, and I think he still has the potential to be a decent starter somewhere else. Not somebody that plays 60 games like he used to for the Ducks, but somebody that can play 40, 45 and get good results for you. And I think in Gibson's case, I want to see him be on an actual contender, and I still think the Ducks are too far away from that to actually make it happen for him. But at $6.4 million, I think that's a reasonable contract, at least for how well he's done this season. Now, the next player on this list is another goaltender, and this is an idea that I'm not really sure is going to happen, but I wanted to speculate about it anyways, and that is potentially a swap between John Gibson and Elvis Merzlikins. Now, Merzlikins, I also think, is another goaltender that will get dealt. I think for Columbus, they, really want to energize and rejuvenate that goaltending position for next year. It's been a really big weakness for them this season, with how much the offense has been firing on all cylinders, with how much the defensive players like Zach Werenski have been absolutely carrying the load. The goaltending just hasn't been there. Even with all the success that Columbus has had, Merzlikins is still an .891 save percentage in 52 games. Just not good enough. I mean, if Columbus was able to get a .900 goaltender, they'd be in a playoff position by now, in my opinion. They have been just so interesting, so fun to watch, but the goaltending, I think, has really held them back. And Merzlikins especially, I think the writing is on the wall, man. He's been, I think, overrated for a long time now, but just hasn't been able to get the consistent results. I mean, you go back to his time with Columbus and how it started out, his rookie season, and how good he was there, and even his sophomore season, how good he was with a .907 save percentage. Since then, every single season below 900, and I think for Columbus, they got to get out of it before it gets worse. Now, I don't know how much Anaheim would actually want to do that since they only really save $1 million, and I don't think Merzlikins is an upgrade by any means over Gibson. So I don't know from Anaheim's angle if it would be picks coming back or maybe an established NHLer, but I think Gibson, in terms of an upgrade for Columbus, could be really fascinating. But I think both of these goaltenders, whether they're exchanged for each other or not, will get dealt no matter what. Now let's keep going, and we had a pair of Detroit Red Wings earlier. Now let's go on to a pair of Seattle Kraken players. First, starting out with Andre Burakovsky. Now, I think a big thing for Seattle this offseason is to just keep giving opportunity to the younger players who have been so good in their system, and I think really give them so much more of a future. But you have a forward group that's pretty balanced, but is kind of all over the place, and Burakovsky is a big part of that. A big signing by Seattle a couple of seasons ago, but really has not been able to establish consistent health or success. It's really either one or the other. This year, he's been pretty healthy, but he's just been largely fine for Seattle. In 74 games, it's 10 goals, 25 assists for 35 points. He's nowhere near the player he was in his really last couple of years in Colorado. You could see 61 points in his last season there. He really was able to get the bag, and that was great for him, but that consistent result has just not really been there with the Kraken, and he's had his moments, obviously. The skill is still radiant, and I think he still can give a lot for a contender, but I think for Seattle, of how much they want to give more opportunity to you, if you have a player like Yanni Naiman and how good he's been recently as well, the wing space is going to be drying up quick, and I think a player like Burakovsky is just somebody who's a lot more expendable right now for Seattle. Plus, for how much Seattle is getting younger, I think they're going to want to keep those experienced veterans and leaders on the team. Jordan Eberle as the captain, Jaden Schwartz as an assistant captain. Burakovsky, though, is neither a leader on or off the ice, and I think that's a reason why he'll get dealt eventually. The second player I wanted to bring up, though, was Jamie Oleksiak on the defensive side. And I think for Seattle, as much as opportunity there is in the forward group, there's also opportunity on the defense. Then now, they have still quite a few younger players still getting their systems going in the AHL. But I think in Jamie Oleksiak's case, he's somebody that I still think is likely to get dealt. And especially with the interest that's out there for this humongous physical defenseman, I think he could still provide a lot of value. Now, I think for him, mostly at this point, the defensive game, even though it's not as great as it was in his late season with Dallas, and the first couple of seasons in Seattle, he's still a solid player. And I think as a fourth defenseman who can bring you some physicality, bring you some penalty kill minutes, and just eat as much time as possible, Alexiak will do the job for you. And at $4.6 million, very reasonable cap hit. Now let's keep going for the trade targets, and next up, let's go on to the Toronto Maple Leafs, and a pretty easy lock, I would say, to get dealt this offseason. Let's go on to Max Domi, who I think is just going to be a pretty clear cap casualty this year. And it's unfortunate because I think when Max Domi is on his game, he's actually a pretty solid player. But the problem is that most of the time, Max Domi is not at the top of his game and is one of the most inconsistent players in the NHL. You can see this year for Toronto, 31 points in 68 games after having a pretty solid season last year, playing most of the games, which was a big milestone for him after not doing it for a while, getting 47 points in 80 games there. I think in Domi's case, even though the highs are high, the lows are extremely low. And especially in his case, playing as a third-line center position and filling that role, he's had some great moments, but has not been able to play that position as effectively as it wanted, especially in the defensive side. When it comes to the face-off ability, Domi's just largely not a center, in my opinion, and not somebody that can fill that role long-term. I think for the Leafs, they're going to really want to upgrade that position, especially with Tavares and his free agency looming. There's a lot to talk about there. But in Domi's case, making $3.75 million, I just don't think he's really shown himself to be worth that as of yet. And of course, for the Leafs, when every single penny counts, when you have players like Domi and Kampf who have been largely ineffective, it makes things a lot more complicated. Though I think in Domi's case, he's a lot easier to trade just because of the versatility in his game, and for other teams, how much they can always just use a little bit more scoring in their middle six. Now we go on to one of the most interesting younger players in the league here next up. Let's move on to the Utah Hockey Club and Matias Maccelli. And this one I think is unfortunate because I was a huge Maccelli fan coming into this season, but it's been a rough one for him, man. I mean, the last couple of seasons in Arizona, he was an exceptional player for them. One of their most underrated creators offensively, and the playmaking was astronomical. It was unbelievable what he was able to create, but this year, it's just, everything's gone wrong for him, it feels like. The luck, the opportunity, and just the teammates around him, the fit, it just hasn't been there in any situation. And you see 55 games this year, 8 goals, just 10 assists for 20 points. Brutal there. I mean, you look at his rookie season, and he had 38 assists. Now he's down to a projected 11, and it is a pretty sharp decline. I think for Maccelli, it was a similar position, though not as extreme as a Lukas Reichel, where I think he could really use a change of scenery here. In Maccelli's case, he's brought results for this franchise before, but I think also if Utah being one of those teams that I think is going to be heavily active in free agency, going after big names to try to bolster that team for a playoff run next year, I think that leaves a smaller player like Maccelli out of the picture completely. And with how much Utah, of course, is wanting to add big bodies, physicality onto their lineup, we've seen that with the drafting, with especially the defenseman they brought in. Matias Maccelli is far from that type of player, and he's definitely not the level of a Clayton Keller or Nick Schmaltz, where he's playing at the top of the lineup, and Utah can afford to have that situation in their top 6. In Maccelli's case, he just has not been a fit, and I think for Utah, especially for how much they are going to want to be improving this next year, Maccelli, I think, is a pretty obvious deal. Now let's go to another younger player in the Western Conference that I see getting dealt this offseason, and another pretty obvious one, I would say, in Jordan Spence of the LA Kings. Now, a pretty similar situation as well to Maccelli, where a younger player that I think has a lot of potential, but I think the Kings will be going in a different direction this offseason, whether that's adding a defenseman or just wanting to give more time to a player like Brant Clark as well. Jordan Spence as another younger right defenseman, I just don't think is going to have that opportunity going forward. I like him a lot still as a really smart, deceptive defenseman, but I just don't think he's somebody that really fits too much into the LA Kings system long-term, at least for what they want. I think they're want to get bigger, and you also have a player like Brant Clark who is already having his struggles there as a younger player. I think Spence is just not going to have that upside and really time on ice long-term. And I do feel bad for him because, again, I like this player quite a bit, but it might be a similar situation to a Matt Roy where the Kings just have to go in a different direction because they decide to, and it leaves a really talented player off their roster. I think in Spence's case, though, especially with the youth, he's going to be an enticing player for a ton of teams out there. I mean, especially if I'm a team like the San Jose Sharks, too, of their defense and how many opportunities there are there, Spence to me is just such a perfect fit. Next up, let's move on to the New York Islanders, a team that has had nobody important score against them over the last week, and go on to their trade target for this offseason. To me, the big one that is most likely to get dealt is Jean-Gabriel Pageau. To me, a player that we could have seen as a deadline deal, but I think with Brock Nelson getting dealt, that was going to be the major one. In Pageau's case, though, I think he's another center that the Islanders are eventually going to get rid of here. I mean, it just makes sense, especially especially with Cal Ritchie likely coming onto the roster next season. You're going to want to give some opportunity to him. In Pajot's case, though, I just don't think he's going to be the type of player that long-term has too much value for the Islanders with him aging at this point, even though he's had his moments, and this year, some pretty decent production, 38 points in 73 games. He's just somebody that I think deserves a better opportunity on, quite frankly, a better team. And even though he's been playing that third-line center spot for a while, and that's where I think he likely will be on a different team, I just want to see him get another run. One last shot to go for that Stanley Cup, especially since his cap hit is pretty reasonable at $5 million, but also is a little bit too much, I think, for the Islanders to want to stomach, especially with players like Noah Dobson needing massive pay upgrades. I mean, for the Islanders, there's a real opportunity here to get younger, to really prioritize this year's draft, which already with the prospect pool that has been really rising over the last couple of years could be really interesting. A Pajot trade, I think, would get them quite a bit, especially with the playoff pedigree that Pajot has always exuded. I think for a lot of teams out there that want to make the playoffs next season, he's going to be pretty valuable there. Now we go into a player that I don't really know how much value there's going to be out there for him. Let's go into the Minnesota Wild and go on to Jakob Trenin, who is a fascinating one because he's somebody that I could genuinely see there being nobody that wants to trade for him. Because even though I liked him in his time with Nashville, I mean, geez, it's not been the greatest last year and a half for him. After getting traded to Colorado, he wasn't really much of a factor there after having a lot of hype behind him. And then this year with Minnesota, he's been just kind of largely ineffective, irrelevant. I mean, in 72 games, his 6 goals, 14 points. And it's not like his production was ever unbelievable outside of that. I mean, his best is 24 points in 2023 in only 77 games. But I think he was still a effective bottom 6 physical player that could bring some good elements. In Minnesota, it just feels like he's not even out there when he is playing. It just doesn't even feel like he's even affecting the game, which is different than his play beforehand. There was a reason why Colorado wanted to trade for him in the playoffs, but it just hasn't really worked for him in both the Avs system or the Wild system either. And I mean, I would say a change of scenery is in order, but he really hasn't played well anywhere since he got dealt from Nashville. Now we're going to keep on to the Western Conference and the Central Division. Next up, let's go on to the Nashville Predators, and this is where I'm going to have Ryan O'Reilly. Now, there is so many different players I could put in this spot for Nashville. You could have Colton Sissons, you could have a player like Jonathan Marchessault, maybe even a Steven Stamkos if you want to get crazy. But I think Ryan O'Reilly is by far the easiest and the most likely to get dealt. He's had his ups and downs, of course, with Nashville, and last season was terrific for them, 69 points in 82 games. This year, though, I think has gone back down to his normal level for the future. A 40, 50-point centerman, solid defensive abilities, but of course the leadership being one of the main parts there. The big reason why I see Ryan O'Reilly getting dealt, though, is just how good that contract is. I mean, it's pretty different from a lot of the older signees on Nashville right now, but O'Reilly's contract is actually really flexible. He makes $4.5 million for the next 2 seasons after this, and he has 0 trade protection whatsoever, which is a pretty rare thing for a player of his status at his age. I think in O'Reilly's case, he is so easy to get dealt, so easy to get some good value from, and making $4.5 million, I mean, even if he's at the level he was at this year, I think that's still relatively fair value, if not exceeding the value there for O'Reilly, and especially for teams looking for a middle 6 centerman who brings the habits that O'Reilly has. There's, I think, very few options out there that can match the potential that he brings. Now let's go into the final 2 players here, and next up let's go on to the Montreal Canadiens, and my pick for the most likely player to get dealt is Josh Anderson. Now, we've been saying that Josh Anderson is likely to get dealt for a while now, I think at least a couple of years, but I think this is really the time to strike, because I think he's starting to really show, especially in the second half, his value that he can bring. Now, that might be a reason why they end up keeping him, but I think that would be a little bit of a mistake personally, because even though he has his moments here and there, he still is on pace for 27 points this year, which I just don't think is good enough, especially for the type of money that the Habs are paying him at $5.5 million. This is a team that still is near the cap, especially with how many contracts they have like Anderson. They're taking up more money than they should. But you have a lot of youth coming up that I think are deserving of roster spots, and quite frankly, can bring the amount of value and offense that Anderson brings at a much lower cap hit. I mean, a player that's been proving me wrong all throughout this process is a player like Florian Xhekaj. I mean, you could have a player like that on the fourth line who could bring the grit and the rough and tumble game that Anderson brings, and probably a better skating ability for, what, like a fifth of the money? And I think for Montreal, even though they want to still be a competitive team going forward, I don't think they should sacrifice having these older contracts just for the sake of having these older contracts. In Anderson's case, I don't think, of course, is going to be an immediate deal, but I think a draft trade, especially if he were to have a solid playoffs, could really prop up his value. And again, I think this would be the best time to trade for him while that reputation is still intact. Now let's go on to the last player I'm going to talk about here, and the biggest surprise may be on the list, but if we're looking at the Canucks moves that they made recently, it might not really be much of a surprise. Let's go into Thatcher Demko, who I think is going to be one of the most interesting players in this year's offseason, because Vancouver's made a lot of different moves over the last year, a bunch of them to try and scrape to be competitive again, but it seems like the goaltending position has been shifting in a major way, with Thatcher Demko, of course, being the starter for a long time there in Vancouver, putting up great results before this season. The health has continued to be an issue almost year after year, and even though it was pretty solid last season, he, of course, wasn't able to play in the playoffs, and that was a major issue. This season, the health has continued to be an issue, and when he has played, he hasn't really been that great either, having an .891 save percentage. He's been average, I would say. But of course, you had the Canucks acquiring Kevin Lankinen and signing him to that big extension. It's not as much money as Thatcher Demko, but it's pretty close. And it seems like for Vancouver, they've kind of settled on their goaltending situation going forward. That if Thatcher Demko isn't healthy, they have Lankinen to be there. Maybe they want to keep that going for the future, but I don't know. I think for Vancouver, this offseason is going to feature a lot of major moves, and especially if you have a Thatcher Demko trade, that could give you some value to the forward group especially, which I think needs it. It would definitely be strange to see a Demko trade with how much he's been such an influence to that Canucks team getting to a better spot, but I think the health has just been a continual issue, and especially for Vancouver, with how much I think they want to change up that roster for next season. Trading Demko for a forward or a defenseman, I think is honestly something they should consider now that they've put themselves in the Kevin Lankinen camp. Now, before we go, I wanted to talk about today's sponsor in BetUS TV, the place to make all your hockey picks, not just throughout this regular season, but of course on the playoffs as well. So much to make, whether it be Stanley Cup picks or daily NHL games, BetUS TV is the place to make it, and a big thank you to BetUS TV for sponsoring today's video. But that is it for my picks for the offseason trades we will see this summer. A lot of players that I didn't even mention today that I could see getting dealt, but I want to know down below, who do you guys see as the most likely players to get dealt? Some surprises that you could see being traded this summer? Let me know all your thoughts down below. Of course, make sure that like button, hit that subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you haven't already for more hockey trade content just like this all throughout the year. Of course, share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online if you guys would be so generous. And if you want to watch some more videos of mine, click on this card right here for all of my trading room content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan, and I hope you have a fantastic hockey day, and goodbye.